In this Torah portion, the word is Shemot. And we start a new book, Exodus, which means going out. The Hebrew word for Exodus is Shemot. For this book is Shemot, which means names. And that it follows the custom of naming books in the Bible according to its significant word, which reads, "Now these are the names." And the first verse lists the descendants of Jacob who came to Egypt to live in Goshen. And after the death of Joseph and the rest of his brothers, the last to die was Levi at the age of 137. In Exodus verse 6:16, it mentions him. And according to the timeline chart, you'll see that Levi was the last to die. Verse 8 of Shemot, chapter 1, we see that there arose a new Pharaoh over Egypt, who did not acknowledge Joseph's contribution to the salvation of their people. Verse 9, threatened by their growing numbers and fearful that they would join Egypt's enemy, the new Pharaoh commanded the Hebrews to force and oppressive labors, supervised by cruel taskmasters, to build the storage cities of Pithom and Ramses. Verse 12. But despite the hardship, Israel increased in numbers. I would like to stop here for a moment and mention the half-Torah listed in this Torah portion of Isaiah chapter 28 and 29. Now we know that Isaiah was a faithful prophet of Israel when Israel turned their backs from Yah. Now, the failure to discern the coming divine judgment from the prophetic words of Isaiah, they said, "Who does he think we are to require his instructions? Are we merely children? All we ever hear from the prophet is the same tired old gibberish." And the prophet Isaiah was giving them good instructions, precepts upon precepts, line upon line, which means many small answers over a period of time. He said, "They shall fall and be broken, they shall be snared and taken." Judgment from God, whom they refuse to comprehend. Precepts upon precepts, line upon line. Many small answers over a period of time. There's another example in these two chapters. Isaiah was warning them about mixed worship with strange and cruel idol worship. And they lost the ability to discern. He says, "The crown of pride, the drunkard of Ephraim, shall be trodden under feet." These folks were not just drunks. They were spiritually drunk with pride. It made them blind, deaf, and dumb. They didn't reason and didn't want to deal with God's ways, rule, or laws. It's the kind of spiritual drunken pride that Satan has. It intoxicated a third of God's angels to join him. A very powerful, infectious influence, drunken pride. It has ruined kingdoms. It deceives folks into believing that it's okay to mix pagan practices with God's doctrine and worship. Now, I have noticed that when a nation reaches a certain measure of wickedness, God passes judgment on them. Example, the Canaanites that were in the Promised Land. Israel is no exception. We serve a just God. And this measure of judgment has come to the Egyptian people and Pharaoh. Exodus chapter 5, verse 1 and 15. Now Pharaoh commanded the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, to kill all male infants at birth. Another example of spiritual drunken pride. Verse 22, the Pharaoh decreed that every newborn Israelite male was to be drowned in the Nile River. Exodus chapter 2, verse 1. It says, And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took a wife, a daughter of Levi. And verse 2. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. I want to stop here for a moment and talk about Moses' mom. Her name is Jochebed, and she was married to a man named Amram. The mother of Moses is famous in the eyes of God, not because she bore the baby Moses, but because of her faith, a faith that knew no defeat, a faith, not a saving faith, but a sustaining faith. A sustaining faith speaks of the trust in God that is exercised daily in order to live in the power of His might and to serve God acceptably. Sustaining faith is the assurance that the things which God has said in His words is true, and that He will act according to what He has said. In Ephesians chapter 6, Paul writes on the things that we should put on to fight. He says we should have on the belt of truth and the coat of righteousness. Our feet should be shod with the readiness of the gospel of peace, and above all this, put on the shield of faith, by which you and I shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked. Not just saving faith, but sustaining faith. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, it tells us that it's our duty to walk by faith in this world until we come to live by sight in the kingdom of God. But in the meantime, we should have this kingdom, this heavenly kingdom, should be established in our hearts, soul, and spirit. God's throne should be on our hearts, our wills to do His good instructions, which will illuminate our understanding. One day we will see this heavenly kingdom with our own eyes, but for right now, it should be in our very hearts, the center of our being. So the life of Jochebed is an amazing demonstration of the walk of faith, sustaining faith. God will move kingdoms to fulfill his promises. He moved upon the heart of the pagan princess at the exact time baby Moses appeared to the very place she bathed, bathing in the very waters that her father dirtied with Hebrew drowned male infants. Yah responds to the faith of folks who dare to trust in him. Moses grew and became her son, a prince of Egypt. One day, Moses went out to be among his kinsmen and saw their suffering. A taskmaster was beating on his kin. Moses killed that man and buried him in the sand. Moses, afraid that his crime would be known, and sure enough, Pharaoh heard the news and sought to have him executed. He fled to Midian, where his distant cousin lived. There he defended the 7 daughters who were being bullied when they went to water their sheep. He married one of those daughters, and her name was Zipporah, and they had 2 sons, Gershom and Eliezer. Now God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. It says, chapter 2, verse 25, says, and God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. Chapter 3, verse 1, on the day Moses was tending sheep near Mount Horeb, and this word means desolate. Verse 2, chapter 3 of Exodus says, and the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Verse 3, and Moses says, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. Verse 4. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see God, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. I want to stop here for a moment and go to a half Torah. Listed here is Jeremiah chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 3. Now God's words has taken residence in chosen individuals at a particular time and place. In Jeremiah, the words God put in his mouth was watched over by God. Yah told him to speak without fear. The hand of God touched his mouth. The ministry that God called Jeremiah to be in was when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians were God's instrument of judgment to Israel. And Jeremiah did not want this call because he thought himself too young. For Moses, Yah called him to deliver his people, and his ministry was that Pharaoh and the Egyptians were the target of God's judgment. And Moses didn't want this call because of his lack of speaking ability. Chapter 4, verse 10. Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent. And he also says, I am slow of speech and of slow tongue. 11. And the Lord said unto him, Who has made man's mouth? Or whose maketh the dumb, or deaf, or the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Verse 12. Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. Verse 22. And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my first son, even my firstborn. And this speaks on the authority that the firstborn inherited from the father. Verse 29. And Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders. Now those elders, the priests and the scribes of Israel. And in verse 31, it says, when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel, and that he looked upon their afflictions, that they bowed their heads and they worshipped him. Now in chapter 5, Pharaoh made it harder for them to make bricks by denying them straws. In verse 20, it says, And the officers of the children of Israel, the officers were the overseers, the supervisors. They were trying to deal with this problem, and they saw Moses and Aaron stood in the way as they came from Pharaoh. And then they said to them, The Lord look upon you and judge, because you had made us to stink, to be hated in the eyes of Pharaoh, to put a sword in his hand so he can kill us. And the only thing that Moses could do, that any of us could do, is run to the Lord for answers. Because it's all in God's timing, not ours. And I don't know when the length of time when Moses sought the Lord and the time when the Lord said this in chapter 6, verse 1. When the Lord said, Now shall you see what I will do to Pharaoh? For with a strong hand shall he let them go. It could have been weeks or it could have been months. But rest assured that in God's timing, all his promises will be fulfilled. The word is Shemot.